Okay, we are recording and we are in chapter 15. I encourage you to open up your Bibles. And I've entitled chapter 15, Samson Out of Control. Samson out of control. So let's take a moment and review. Last week we studied Samson's foolish, prideful riddle and the subsequent results of his actions. And those actions were he went to Ashkelon, verse 19 of chapter 14, and killed 30 men, first-degree murder. I also proposed to you his wife's downward spiral that reveals her character. Lack of marital intimacy, where she favored her family more than her husband. Her fear of retaliation if she did not comply with these men who wanted to know the answer to the riddle, and then her manipulating Samson. We also witnessed Samson's anger, as I mentioned, resulting in first-degree murder. And we also read that he abandoned his wife, who was then given to his best man, verse 20 of chapter 14. But Samson's wife, verse 19, then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, and he went down to Ashkelon and killed 30 of them, Philistines, and took their spoils and gave the changes of clothes to those who told the riddle, and his anger burned, and he went up to his father's house. So he abandons his wife, he deserts her, and Samson's wife, verse 20, was given to his companion who had been his friend. Now in the Hebrew, that means his best man. So let's begin to take a look at the outline. First of all, in the first two verses of chapter 15, Samson tries to reconcile with his wife. In verse 1 of chapter 15 of the book of Judges, we read, "But after a while, in the time of wheat harvest, Samson visited his wife with a young goat and said, 'I will go in to my wife in her room,' but her father did not let him enter. Her father said, 'I really thought that you hated her intensely, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please let her be yours instead.'" Let me make some observations here. Let me start out with a question here. What motivates Samson to try to reconcile with his wife? I think the scripture tells us he has no idea that her father gave her away to another man, Samson's best man. Here's what I think is taking place. Samson is lonely. I would propose to you that his loneliness is not for companionship with the daughter of the Philistines, but for sex. It clearly states that he would go back and have sexual relations with her. He even thinks that things can be smoothed over by bringing her father a present of a young goat to try and ease the stigma of his anger. You might wonder, boy, that's a really odd gift, but in Genesis 38, verse 17, a young goat was a customary gift to pay for sexual favors. Samson returned home. We do not know the time span before he tries to return to Timnah. All it says in verse 1 is, "But after a while." So how long did he stay home? Did mom and dad kick him out? Did mom and dad say, "You need to go back to your wife, you're married now"? We don't know. There was a span of time, though. If we read carefully, Samson approaches the father with the gift, requesting permission to have sexual relations. But we read that the father refused, and in verse 2, the father explains why. He says, "I really thought that you hated her intensely, so I gave her to your companion Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please let her be yours instead. Now, this is the reasoning of the father. Now, look at it from the father's perspective. Samson left in anger. He was very upset with his wife, who allowed herself to be used by her kin to pull the answer to the riddle out of Samson by all of her weeping and pleading. Samson told those who answered the riddle that they had plowed with his heifer. And we explained what that parable or that proverb was. One person suggests that while he was gone, Samson's wife polluted her father's thinking towards Samson as a contributing factor that the father-in-law did not want Samson returning. But nonetheless, Samson communicated that he truly did hate her, and to prevent further shame and embarrassment to the family, the father gave her to another man. This was probably very customary to do back in this culture. And it was also customary to hear what the father-in-law said to Samson in verse 2. The father offers a conciliatory bride, and in doing so impugns the beauty of Samson's wife, stating her sister was more beautiful. And we know what Samson thought of his wife, that she looked good to him. And this would have been a custom and procedure that was carried out back in Bible times. Now, Samson's justified sinful actions, verses 3 to 8. Then Samson said to him, he's talking to the father-in-law, this time I shall be blameless in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm. Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took torches and turned the foxes tail to tail and put one torch in the middle between the two tails. And when he had set fire to the torches, he released the foxes into the standing grain of the Philistines, thus burning up both the shocks and the standing grain along with the vineyards and groves. Then the Philistines said, who did this? And they said, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he took his wife and gave her to his companion. So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. Samson said to them, since you act like this, I will surely take revenge on you, but after that I will quit. He struck them ruthlessly with a great slaughter, and he went down and lived in the cleft of the rock at Etam. Now, what's going on here? Samson refuses the father-in-law's offer. He goes further, telling his ex-father-in-law that his future actions will be justified. He cannot be blamed for what he is thinking and what he will do. I want you to note the text says this clearly, when I do them harm. So he has every intention of acting out his anger in a sinful fashion, but justifying it by blaming them for what they had done to him. Now, if you stop and think about it, it's going to take time for Samson to formulate his plan, gather the resources, and set the plan in motion. Samson is a cunning person. He recognized the timing is perfect because it is the time of wheat harvest. Samson went and caught 300 foxes. This in and of itself would take time. Then you have the problem of hiding them, feeding them without being observed and questioned. Many commentators understand the Hebrew word for foxes is better understood as jackals, which often ran in packs of 200 or more, making it easier to understand the quantity in this story. Now, the scripture says that he ties two jackals together by their tails, then ties a torch to their tails. When he's done, he has 150 pairs, or a total of 300, that have been prepared. And he strategically places each pair in a prime place for massive destruction, lights the torches, and sets them free, one pair at a time. The unharvested grain is burned, the shocks gathered in bundles are consumed, even the vineyards and groves were torched. Although not recorded, it is safe to conclude the panic of the jackal pairs, along with their inability to free themselves from each other, let alone the torch that they were dragging behind them, caused their demise. Now, not everyone knew it was Samson who did this, but there were a few who could answer the question, who did this? And it appears that it was common knowledge what Samson's ex-father-in-law did, because they say very clearly in verse 9 that he gave Samson's wife to his companion. These men burned Samson's ex-wife and father-in-law with fire. Now remember in chapter 14, verse 15, these 30 men who heard the riddle after 3 days could not answer it and went to her, Samson's wife, and threatened her with the very thing that would take place in her life. They threatened to burn her and her father. If you read the text carefully, it appears there is a confrontation between Samson and the owners of the crops. Because in verse 7, it says, Samson said to them, "Since you acted like this, I will surely take revenge on you, but after that I will quit." It comes after they burn her and her father to death. Samson tells them that because of their actions, he would take revenge, and when he is satisfied, he will quit. Now, the Hebrew concept here for revenge means to entertain revengeful thinking and feelings. The motivation for Samson's action is not a sense of justice or to right a wrong. It is to satisfy his feelings of anger. It is to give expression to his anger. Verse 8 said, he struck them ruthlessly with a great slaughter, and he went down and lived in the cleft of the rock of Etam. Now, the idea in verse 8, where it says he struck them ruthlessly, means he attacked them hip and thigh. This is a proverbial expression. And what it means is cruel, unsparing slaughter. Cruel and unsparing slaughter. In other words, Samson was a one-man army against the Philistines, and he gave no quarter. Now, all of his actions, stop and think where we are at and where he's come from. He violated his Nazirite vow. He violated the first, fifth, sixth, and 10th commandments. He married outside of the faith. He used pride to elevate himself, resulting in a life of isolation and loneliness. He's got no friends, no mention of his family. He's left alone with his anger and his guilt, because it says in verse 8, after he had his slaughter, he went and dwelled in the cleft of the rock of Etam, which is a short journey away from Timnah. Now, all of his actions resulted in isolation and loneliness. It's interesting that revenge leads a person into slavery. And this is what has happened to Samson. Now, Samson is betrayed by his own people. I find this a bit strange. The very people that he is trying to rescue turn on him. In verses 9 to 13, then the Philistines went up and camped in Judah and spread out in Lehi. Now, the Philistines own Judah. They were the pagan nation that had come in and invaded Judah. In fact, they were never really driven out. I'll show that to you in a minute. And the men of Judah said, they went out, they sent a delegation out saying, "Why have you come up against us?" So they're drawn up in military array. And the Philistines answered and said, "We have come up to bind Samson in order to do to him as he did to us." Do you see the tit for tat here that's going on? Revenge begets revenge, and nothing gets resolved. In verse 11, do you find this odd? 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cliff of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us?" And he said to them, "As they did to me, so I have done to them." And they said to him, "We have come down to bind you so that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines." And Samson said to them, "Swear to me that you will not kill me." So they said to him, "No, but we will bind you fast and give you into their hands, yet surely we will not kill you." Then they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. Now the Philistines are camped in Judah near a place called Lehi. They are already in full control of Judah, having captured this tribe for the 3rd time. The first time was under Othniel, if you remember that, then under Ibzan, and now Samson. This was all due to the initial failure of Judah to drive out the inhabitants of the land because they had iron chariots, if you remember that from Judges chapter 1 and 2. But their arrival causes concern to the inhabitants. They are in military attire, ready for battle. A delegation approaches them inquiring what is the meaning of this presence, because it was more than just coming to collect taxes. They simply inform Judah that they have no quarrel with them, but they want to bind Samson and inflict upon him similar punishment that he inflicted upon them. Again, as I mentioned, we see revenge and retaliation. Now the men of Judah are cognizant of Samson's strength and power. Perhaps they heard what he did to the lion and then with the jackals. 3,000 men go to apprehend Samson. 3,000. They evidently know where Samson is dwelling, so there's no need for a search party to discover where he's at. Now, from their perspective, Samson is bringing down more hardships upon them by what he has done. They scold him using insulting ridicule by reminding Samson that the Philistines are rulers over them. One person commented that the men of Judah were more loyal to their captors than they were to their deliverer. However, I do not think they saw Samson as a deliverer, but a troublemaker. They asked Samson to explain what he has done. What motivated him? Samson exposes his immaturity and, like a little child, essentially quips that he simply did to them what they did to him. They tell Samson why they have come. Samson has one request, that his brethren do not kill him. One person suggested this was an act of submission and trust in Jehovah to protect him. I wonder if Samson is calculating the odds. He sees the 3,000 men of his kin are those who come to take him back as large or smaller in quantity. Samson has established his reputation as a fierce fighter by killing the 30 men of Ashkelon and then the great slaughter of those who burned the house down on his father-in-law and his wife. Now the men of Judah pledged they will not kill Samson, but only bind him and turn him over to the Philistine delegation. The scripture says they used 2 new ropes to bind Samson. Now the Egyptians used leather strips as what we consider ropes for tying and binding. The Jews adapted the leather strips as ropes. So Samson was bound by 2 leather strips. The length and width are not known, but had to be sufficient, long enough to accomplish the purpose of pinning his arms against the side of his body. The men of Judah lead Samson out of the cave. This one-man wrecking crew was bound. Now in verses 14 to 17, we see a third time that the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Samson. Verse 14 says, when he came to Lehi, the Philistines shouted as they met him. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, so that the ropes that were on his arms were like flax that is burned with fire, and his bonds dropped from his hands. And he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, so he reached out and took it and killed 1,000 men with it. Then Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, and with the jawbone of a donkey, I have killed 1,000 men. When he had finished speaking, he threw the jawbone from his hand, and he named that place Ramah Lehi. Now let's understand a couple of things here that I find interesting as we study the scriptures. The men of Judah came down from the mountain, the rock of Etam, and traveled to Lehi, probably a short trip of 3 to 5 miles. When the Philistines saw Samson bound, being led like a tied ox, they cheered and shouted as if they had just won a tremendous battle. In the midst of their prideful celebration, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson mightily. Now, this is the third record of such an empowerment. Chapter 14, verse 6, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him with the lion. Chapter 14, verse 19, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him down in Ashkelon, and then here. Now, the leather ropes that the men of Judah took such great effort to retain Samson became like flax. Flax is a weak binding substance unless soaked in water. The Spirit of the Lord empowered Samson to break the leather rope as flax, as easily as consumed by fire, according to the scripture we just read. He continues towards the Philistines. You think he might retreat back up into the mountain. The Spirit of the Lord directs his attention to a fresh jawbone of a donkey. This is a picture. Notice the scriptures is clear, fresh, in that it has not begun to dry out and become brittle. It is still extremely strong. The donkey's jawbone is an object of worship for the eccentric people of Ramah Lehi, who have even gone so far as to erect a temple dedicated to preserving the sacred artifact. So in reality, Samson defeats one of the gods of the Philistines with the very thing that they worshiped. Samson picked up the jawbone and killed 1,000 men. Remember that the Philistines had rallied at Judah, prepared for a military battle. Samson is a valiant warrior and single-handedly killed 1,000 of their troops. Get this, while 3,000 men of Judah who came to bind him and offer him up as a sacrificial lamb stood by and did nothing. These 3,000 men were more afraid and loyal to the Philistines than inspired by Samson. It appears as Samson killed these Philistines, he piled the bodies up. In and of itself, that must have been an amazing sight. But this one man's spirit, empowered by divine courage, did not motivate his brethren to rise up, to be men, and join in the possible defeat and removal of the Philistines. After piling up 1,000 bodies, he exalts himself with another poem. Now, the gist of the poem as you read it is quite simple. Look what I have done. That's the gist of the poem. Look at what I have done. Now, let's back up here to the outline. Samson complains. In verse 18 and 19, we read this. Then he became very thirsty. Well, I guess after killing 1,000 people and stacking them up like cords of wood, yeah. And he called to the Lord and said, You have given me this great deliverance by the hand of your servant. And now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? But God split the hollow place that is in Lehi, so that the water came out of it. When he drank, his strength returned, and he was revived. Therefore he named it En-Hakkore, which is in Lehi to this day. Samson complains. Well, let's look at something. He is depleted physically, right? He had to exert a tremendous amount of physical energy in this one-sided battle. He is thirsty, he is parched. At least he cries out to the Lord instead of his usual self-asserting ways. He acknowledges that the Lord gave him the victory. This is the first record of Samson's spiritual awareness in his life. This is the first record recorded by the Spirit of God of Samson's interest in spiritual things. All the previous actions and decisions that he made did not acknowledge God. In fact, it flew in the face of God. Now, his praise for God's deliverance turns into self-pity. He seems to charge God with using him and discarding him. He is wondering why God would grant him such a powerful victory and then let him die of thirst and be captured by the very people he defeated. And this is the first record of Samson calling the Philistines uncircumcised. So we got a couple of firsts here. The first record of any spiritual awareness in his life, and the first time that he calls the Philistines uncircumcised. Now, his parents tried to point out this to him when he told them he wanted to marry one of the daughters of the Philistines in chapter 14, verse 3. His parents told him they're uncircumcised. Is Samson feeling like God is only using him to discard him? If this might be a valid proposition, it is a self-revelation on how he has been treating God. Let me repeat that. if the premise is true, if Samson has any degree of validity to his feelings, that God is only using him to discard him, then it appears that this is a self-revelation on how he has been treating God. And I think if you examine his life, you have to come to the conclusion that's how he is treating God. Now, God graciously splits a rock and water comes forth. So Samson is revived, brought out of his fatigue and stupor, and he names that place En-Hekor. And you know what that means? Mountain of the Crier. En-Hekkorn, H-A-K-K-O-R-E-E-N hyphen, means mountain of the crier. Samson forgot evidently how God provided water from the rock for his forefathers with Moses. Now we have a short summary statement of Samson's reign. One single verse in verse 20. He judged Israel for 20 years. That was longer than some, but shorter than others. But don't forget that God appointed him to begin to deliver Israel from the hands of the Philistines. One will never know how much further Samson's influence and power might have gone had he been true to his Nazirite vow. Let's take a look at some lessons here. Marital reconciliation must never be motivated by the absence of sex. Ms. Davis, I know in your counseling, I'm a betting man that as you have dealt with counseling, and perhaps it's been a couple, that the husband wants to get back together again with his wife and have things go back to normal. And what that husband is saying is, I'm starved for sex. I don't want to have companionship. I just want to have safe sex. To get back together again when there is marital difficulties must not be motivated by the absence of sex. And we see that clearly with Samson in verse 1. That was his only motivation to go back to have sex with his wife. Unfairness never justifies a sinful response. Was Samson treated fairly by the 30 men who plowed with his heifer? The answer is no. Was Samson treated fairly when his father-in-law gave his wife to the best man and offered him the younger daughter? No. Does that give him license to handle the unfairness in a sinful way? And the answer is no. Unfairness does not give us permission to justify a sinful response. And we saw him in this chapter do it twice. I'm going to do to them what they did to me. You cannot blame me. I will be blameless for what I'm about to do because what you did. In a sense, unfairness never justifies a sinful response. Is the same thing as blame shifting. Now, man's revenge exasperates a sinful situation. And again, we see this with Samson very clearly. How each time that he sought revenge, the situation became worse and compounded and exasperated, and almost to the point where there was no point of return. The only saving grace that we will see was when Samson pulls down the pillar of the temple of Dagon and has the mass death of the Philistines who are celebrating his capture, his binding, and his blindness. When we seek revenge, there is no fruit that honors God when you seek revenge. And an observer, sometimes it is difficult to see how a person's sinful actions can be part of God's overall program. I tried to address this last week, and sometimes I wonder about it as well, but it clearly states 3 times the Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson mightily. His subsequent actions were sinful. But as we learned, when he wanted to marry this girl and his parents were confused back in chapter 14, they did not know that the Lord was working in the background to accomplish his purpose. Again, as I said last week, this is not license. This is not permission to go out and commit sin, believing that God is going to somehow empower it. But God is God, and he can operate the way that he wants to, and he had a purpose in doing this. I guess a thought for us, as the Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson 3 times. Samson must have been pretty dense. He must have been pretty spiritually dull. And I think that's a fair statement, because this is the first time that we see him having any spiritual awareness whatsoever. And so, as the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, he fails to recognize what the Lord is trying to do, and to do it God's way. He just feels this power come over him. This unusual strength infuse his body. And because he's controlled by his anger and his sexual addiction, he goes off half-cocked and, letter C, exasperates a sinful situation. Oops, one too many. Sometimes when God is mightily using another, it troubles the conscience of others, for they do not want the status quo to be altered. And we saw that in chapter 15, where the 3,000 men came to Samson in verse 11. Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done? Instead of looking to Jehovah that he might be providing a means of liberation from the yoke of the Philistines through Samson, they only viewed Samson as a troublemaker. You're rocking the boat, Samson. Leave it alone. We have learned to adjust to their domination and to their presence. And you will see that even today with people. Someone in a family structure begins to grow bold and courageous about what is right and what is wrong. Even within a Christian family. And the other family members get kind of upset. You know, you're going to offend Aunt Sally. Uncle Joe's going to get angry with you. You can't do that. Let me ask you this question. Is there ever a time where you don't speak truth? Is there ever a situation that you develop lockjaw? Is there ever an event where you do not tell the truth? And I hope you answered, no, there is not. And then finally, when God demonstrates his power on your behalf, do not worry about the smaller details. Samson even acknowledges how God empowered him and helped him. But he became so consumed with self-pity about this little thing of being thirsty. And he even says, why would God do such a big thing and leave the little thing here for me to try to figure out? And you know, sometimes we as Christians can get that way. We can see the mighty hand of God. And then some of the smaller details that are yet to be worked out by the same mighty hand of God who delivered you, he will still work it out. He has not left you to your own devices to figure out the small details. He can't do that because we are not to lean on our own understanding. Samson is quite a character, isn't he? Quite a character. So, thoughts or questions that you might have? Hello, Miss Davis. Good to see you tonight. Questions or comments from anybody?
I had one question on one verse. I didn't understand who that was.
Okay.
It was 15. Is that 15:6 when the Philistines went up and burned her and her father to death? Ooh.
Okay.
Verse 6.
Okay. What don't you understand?
Who is the her?
Samson's ex-wife.
Delilah?
No. Delilah comes later.
Okay.
Yeah, you
I
see,
got you. That's the first. That's the lady who they gave to his friend. I'm good.
Yeah, Samson got married in chapter 14.
Okay.
Delilah doesn't come in
until
Delilah
comes after.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And
all right. Thank you.
These 30 men had threatened Samson's first wife. We don't know her name. It's not recorded.
Mm-hmm.
They threatened his wife about the riddle. Threatened her with fire. Guess what? What goes around comes around. That's what happened. Yeah.
Thank you.
You are welcome. Anybody else?
I have a question.
Hello, Miss Sue. Go ahead.
So after this battle, this last battle that he had, after that, he judged for 20 years?
Yeah. In reality, you have a type of Hebrew literature, and many times they will give you a summary statement as they continue to unfold the story. Sometimes that'll be at the beginning of the person's life. Sometimes it's in the middle. Sometimes it's at the end. So this is a summary statement that Samson ruled for 20 years, not starting at this point. Not starting at this point. At least I don't think so.
Okay, so that could have been just his whole, since he started here in the Bible, that could have been a 20-year period this is covering.
Yes, ma'am, you got it.
Okay, good, because that's what I thought it was like after. Then there was 20 years after that he did all, after this point.
Yeah, if my further study reveals that, I will correct myself, but I believe this is a summary statement.
Okay, got it.
Good deal. Anybody else?
Yeah, I got a question.
Who's this?
Jeanette.
Oh, Jeanette, I'm sorry.
Probably kind of,
go ahead.
It's probably kind of a dumb question.
Stop, Jeanette. There are no
What were they doing? I don't know. What were they doing with a donkey's jawbone?
The donkey had died. And they just let the animal lay on the road and be consumed by birds of prey.
And it just happened to be there for him to, okay.
No, God deliberately placed it there.
Okay, yeah.
Let's not forget that even though Samson is going off half cock, God is still in control.
Yeah, sometimes it makes you wonder why he picks people like that, but.
Well, hang on for a minute. Hang on, let's expand that. You wonder why God picked some of us.
Yeah,
right?
True. True.
Yeah, no, that was a sovereign act of God. And because
it was symbolic, correct?
What was symbolic?
Because it was the jawbone of an ass, and they worship that.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh.
You picked up on that, Jody.
Okay.
Yes.
Yep.
So what God did is I'm going to take your God and I'm going to kill you with your own God. If you wanted
Exactly.
to summarize it that way. Yeah.
Ah, I see.
Good observation, guys.
So I also have a question.
Oh, no.
When
Go ahead, Jody.
it's not going to be what flavor ice cream. It has to do with with your lesson tonight.
Okay.
So when Samson said that, granted this great deliverance by the hand of thy servant, was he talking about his own freedom from being bound, or was he talking about having killed so many of the Philistines?
Both.
Okay.
Both. Yeah. Primarily killing the 1,000 Philistines, but he could have killed
Okay.
the 1,000 Philistines if he didn't break the bonds.
Okay. So they go hand in hand. Okay.
I believe so. Yeah. Yeah. Great question.